So, we're interviewing Larry Stevens, one of the members of the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program. And there'll be a series of questions, starting with, during what years, Larry, were you involved in the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program, and in what capacity?
As a graduate student in 1980, I began researching riparian vegetation in Grand Canyon. And in 1982, the predecessor of the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program began. It was called the Glen Canyon Environmental Studies Program in two phases. One phase started in 1982. That ran until the end of 1987. And in 1987 to 1990 was GCES2. And as a grad student, I was studying the effects of Glen Canyon Dam on riparian vegetation in Grand Canyon. And that put me in a kind of an interesting place, because as this large environmental program was initiated by the Department of Interior, I was a student of riparian ecology and shoreline ecology and the river. And I was able to run quite a few projects and get quite a bit of support for my graduate studies through the program. And I worked then for the National Park Service. After my PhD, I became a volunteer and then an employee of the Department of Interior in the later phases of the GCS program. Took a hiatus of about 4 years, and then began as a representative for environmental purposes, environmental voices, on the present day Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program. We call it the AMP. So since 2004 to the present, I've been on the AMP as both a technical representative and as a full representative of the program.
Great. And while you've been involved in the program all of these decades, what research or projects did you work on, and what do you think you were able to come to understand, insights or results from your research?
It's a long list of projects. I started out working on riparian vegetation, pursued that for almost 20 years in terms of the research looking at the effects of the dam on vegetation. Riparian vegetation is valuable to wildlife and recreationists and many other interests. So there's a lot of interest in how the river affects the shoreline habitat. Those projects and papers range from the natural history of individual species, some native, some non-native plant species along the river, to river ecology as a kind of grand scheme, understanding how flow regulation affects the distribution of shoreline habitats and what that means in terms of germination and propagation of vegetation. In the middle of that, became a Park Service employee and became interested in the endangered species on the river and what their impacts, the impacts of the dam were on those endangered species, and that precipitated a whole series of studies on endangered bald eagles, peregrine falcons, humpback chub, southwestern willow flycatcher, funny little snail we call the Kanab amber snail, and those studies also. Each of those were multi-year efforts with many individuals. As a Park Service ecologist for Grand Canyon, what I did was coordinate teams of researchers. At one point, I had a $3 million a year budget with 9 different teams doing research on everything from geomorphology of the river and the effects of the dam on those topics, through very detailed studies on the life history of a snail, pretty much everything in between. So very coarse scale to fine scale analyses, and played a role then in how the decisions about those resources in relation to dam operations got made, with a whole team of really wonderful researchers to work with there, both academics and policy people. Let's see, those studies gave way to larger scale studies of how rivers function, so that precipitated more interdisciplinary research, and I've been pursuing that for the last 20 years. But also began to understand that these river systems are really fed by small patches of the environment, and those small patches of the environment are quite interesting because they might do a lot of the might support a lot of the species at various times of their lives. For example, tributary mouths, very important for fish movement in and out, fish spawning and whatnot. Springs along the river, also very important for as hotspots of biological activity. And that precipitated a whole wave of studies, and now I run an organization called the Springs Stewardship Institute out of the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff, and that has blossomed into a global inquiry into the ecology and improving stewardship of springs. I bring some of that expertise to the table when I as a representative of the adaptive management work group.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you think the larger purposes of some of those studies was? What was the reason for doing all of that research on the impacts of the dam on, say, riparian vegetation or springs or beaches?
Yeah. So behind all this, I'm also a commercial river runner and a long-time Grand Canyon devotee. So it's the landscape that inspires me most. So it's the love of the land that really captures that attention. And from that larger perspective on landscape, the impact of the dam on this largely wilderness landscape is just really very intriguing because it's such a social circus. So many voices, so many perspectives, and it's over the decades has become the most heavily studied, most intensively studied river on Earth. And getting to interact with all those people, each with their own kind of very particular worldview about how things work, it's a marvelous social environment to be able to engage in, try to improve understanding of, and work for the protection of it.
Did any of the research that you do lead to any management decision-making that made a difference in those ecological conditions that you care about?
Absolutely. As scientists, we're not advocates. We are, except for advocates for good science. However, the topics we choose to pursue do eventually have an impact in some cases. So emphasis on the riparian zone, emphasis on the role of many different meetings where I've participated in where some theme would be taken up, and so I would have the opportunity as a scientist to say, okay, what do we really know about that? How can we get it? How can we improve enough of what we want to know about it to be able to model it and predict what, say, dam impacts are on that given resource, whether it's sand distribution or the shape of sandbars over time, or the arrival of unexpected species in the landscape and how the dam will affect their populations over time. So it's weaving all those things together. Many of the things I've studied have been published and are cited. So it's the decisions that get made about those topics often are falling back on some of the research I did then.
So much of the funding for the program goes to funding research so that we have a more solid knowledge foundation for making adaptive management decisions about dam operations.
Right.
How well do you think the program over time has integrated that scientific research with adaptive management? They're two different things, and they could be integrated well or not so well. What's your opinion about that relationship?
Yeah.
over time?
So an interesting story there, or interesting kind of evolution there, is that when we began, it was a shotgun approach to understanding the system. The Secretary of the Interior said, I don't want this issue on my table. Here's some money. Get it out of my administration. And of course, that worked out quite well. It took 8 years for that to become an environmental impact statement, the second largest in the nation's history. And it took it took it completely out of the context of the Reagan administration and put it into the Clinton administration. So that secretary solved his problem by throwing money at it. But initially, there had been literally no inventory of most of the canyon environment. It's a huge environment, so we really knew almost Very little about it. We had some very good early studies on some of the flow and how flooding happened in 1945. Eddie McKee did a really wonderful paper on how a flood works. Well, so if you're trying to measure flow, the floor of the river drops as you're measuring, as the flood comes through, because the materials are being scoured out, and therefore your flow measurements have to keep in contact with a changing river as they're going through. Great information. Okay, how do you implement that in a almost 300-mile long river to understand how flows are moving through? And what can you and can't you actually get to understand, given the standing of the mathematics and the modeling capacity for understanding flow and sediment transport? All that had to be discovered in the system in a very physical way. How beaches are changing through time. Well, what do you use for? How do you measure that? And some of the earliest measurements were simple survey transects from a point on a beach. Okay, maybe you had 3 transects from one point on a beach. That's not really very much information in terms of how the whole system is changing, and so expanding that network of places that are being monitored, developing technologies that can actually allow you to map the entire surface of the beach and the floor of the river, because everything is changing after a flood moves sediment through. All that had to be discovered here. And I got to play a pretty seminal role in figuring some of that stuff out, so that was quite exciting. In terms of the management decision-making associated with that, various analyses exist, but one of the most popular one is to log transform the flow and sediment transport relationship, which is a power function. When you do that, of course, you get these beautiful straight lines. But if you kind of break those data apart, transform those data, you get this incredible scatter of points. But in doing that, what we discovered is there's a point at about 20,000 to 25,000 CFS, which is the upper level of dam operations, that really starts to bump sediment out. Okay. There's a starting point for making decisions then about flow regulation, and how fast the flow fluctuates. Also plays a role in how much sediment is brought into the water column and shunted out. So discovering those elements and working with people that had the mathematics skills to be able to put those stories together gave us a way to begin to manage the dam. And literally this is the best managed river now in the world in terms of understanding how flow and sediment interact.
Can I ask you to step back and give us concisely a broader perspective on what the larger goal of the adaptive management program is? What's the whole point of having created this AMP?
You want the politically appropriate soundbite or the real reason?
Let's have both.
All right. Well, the real reason is to prevent river management from falling into a lot of litigation. The real purpose of the program is to bring stakeholders together and have them communicate with each other to prevent lawsuits from happening. So that helps facilitate the delivery of power, and maybe to some extent helps with the continuity of the environmental management issues.
In what way does the existence of the adaptive management program eliminate the likelihood of litigation?
When we began in the early 80s, this was a closed-door process. Decisions would get made, they get thrown out to the public could sue the government about some of those decisions. The big brouhaha happened when the Bureau of Reclamation in 1982 decided to rewind the generators and up the amount of flow fluctuation that was going through the river. This is a system that had daily tides of more than 15 feet moving through the river. So it was an incredibly unnatural, bizarre environmental transition to subject this river in the middle of a wilderness to. And by that time, by the early 80s, probably 200,000 pretty wealthy Americans had gone through the river on river trips. And when their guides wrote them and said, we need to slow down this flow fluctuation story and limit that to protect the beaches of Grand Canyon, a lot of people responded. And that's the original decision that the Secretary of the Interior James Watt was responding to in 1982. well, let's throw some money at this and get it out of our hair. So by having that culminated in an environmental impact statement in 1990, 1995, and created a context for public involvement. And now any member of the public can go to the meetings. Any of the stakeholders can sit in the meetings. They're fully apprised of all the information available. They play a role in terms of voting on different issues that may come up in terms of dam management. And if you're involved in that process, it's pretty hard to sue the process, to sue the government for it, because you've been a part of the rulemaking, part of the advisement to the secretary. The purpose of that adaptive management program is to advise the Secretary of Interior how best to manage the dam.
So in a sense, you're saying the project is as much about generating knowledge to inform decision-making as it is about democracy, public engagement, and conflict resolution.
Yes. So the public policy part of it has two sides, though, because every one of the stakeholders has an agenda that they don't fully share. And the federal government, of course, has an agenda that it doesn't fully share. But because this is such a controversial river, there are more politics than water in the Colorado River, as you know. There are, on all sides, there are agendas that are being pushed, many of which conflict directly with each other. There's lots and lots of conflict here. So to limit that contact, to limit that conflict, it becomes an open process. It's become an open process, and with many stakeholders that no longer have to bang their shoe. We actually had one of the stakeholders bang his shoe on the table, but these folks don't have to do that anymore. They actually have gotten to know each other, communicate with each other to some extent, and have a context for being able to air their concerns.
So it's your feeling that it has been overall a successful effort at engaging stakeholders and generating information from scientific research to help improve the management of the river system?
Yes, I would say that the science is stellar, not complete by any means, and not fully far-sighted enough yet, but quite extraordinary scientific achievement in beginning to understand this incredibly complex big river system. That part of it's been quite successful. The social side of it is it's been fabulous to get to know all the different stakeholders, the tribes, the federal agency folks, different departments. The Department of Energy plays a role here. So it's been quite great to be able to engage socially with those folks and really just better understand their points of view. The real test of the program, however, comes when major decisions are made on whole suites of policy. So we just completed the second EIS. After the 20 years of the adaptive management program, we've just completed the second EIS. Was that a smooth process? I don't think any of the stakeholders were completely pleased with the outcome. It maintains a status quo, which is not too surprising, but the ability for any of the scientists or the policy folks to actually really push a shift in policy was pretty limited. So that was informative. The resistance that the federal bureaucracy has to changing the way operations are done was informative. That hasn't changed all that much, I don't think.
So you said the science has been stellar, so that leads to my next question. Has there, in your mind, been any important science that should have been done, that you wanted to do or you wanted other people to do, that has not been accomplished yet?
Much. The quality of the science that has been done has been quite applied, a lot of it quite applied. How do we manage the dam for flow and sediment? That information is world class. There's no other river with this level of understanding and of monitoring to support that. Does that mean we understand how this ecosystem works? No, not there yet. These are questions that will take decades, if not centuries, to really answer. Things like the nutrient dynamics. We created a Lake Powell, this nation's second largest reservoir in the 48 states anyway, second largest reservoir, huge body of water, 180 miles long, and the nutrient dynamics that are going on in the reservoir affect the downstream river. And we're just beginning to piece some of that story together. It's a big question. We have monitoring data. The scientists that are hired through the U.S. Geological Survey have not been ecosystem scientists for the most part. Therefore, we don't get these kind of big issue questions like, okay, we have got an ecosystem that's responding over long periods of time to modified nutrient inputs. And we don't know about that yet. So there's a big arena there still to be opened up. To my disappointment, because I left the riparian vegetation world after working on it for 20 years, we don't have a model of how the dam affects, a predictive model where we can understand how the dam affects the development of riparian vegetation. That's too bad. That's something that's been quite important, because as vegetation grows up in a very profuse way on the beaches, it begins to crowd out campers. The vegetation takes over the camping areas. And so what's the right way to manage that vegetation with flows of the dam? It's also been a situation in which there's a lot of resistance in the part of the water and power components to releasing flows for experimental purposes. And through brute force, we've over the last 25 years or so managed to institute planned flooding in the river. But these are small planned floods. They only run up to 45,000 CFS, which is the total output of the dam, not the spillways. And there are big questions that lie just beyond that envelope of flow that we can't address, haven't been able to address experimentally yet.
Okay, I think we need to break here since it's 2 o'clock, and the next group is coming in 2 minutes.
Okay.
They're actually coming in at 2:15.
Oh, are they?
Yes, so if you want to continue, if you want to go have lunch. So you decide.
I'm
We're
whatever.
Here, let's
Yeah,
continue.
yeah.
Okay, 10 more minutes?
Yeah, 10 more minutes.
Let's see. There I have more to go with what hasn't been done yet.
Mm-hmm.
I represent an environmental voice on the adaptive management work group, and a scientific environmental voice. For me, it's really important to understand what species we have in that river landscape. Not just the fish, some of which are endangered, that attracts all the policy attention. Not just a couple of bird species that are, again, endangered and therefore used for management policy purposes. But what's the total picture of life in that river? We don't know what that is. There are on the order of probably 10,000 insect species, some of which are rare, some of which have probably gone extinct in the last 25 years, 30 years. And so one of the emphases that I place on the system outside of the program is to try to compile information on the biodiversity of the river, because it's simply not known yet. That's a big task, and there's no funding for it, so it's a slow go. But kind of group by group, we're beginning to pull together what actually exists in the river corridor. And there are many new species we've described in the last few years, half a dozen new species of insects and mollusks in the river corridor. So lots still to learn there, and that's another big arena of knowledge to be improved upon, which the program doesn't pay much attention to.
So you've mentioned that you've been involved since 1980, so you've seen a lot of changes come to the program. How would you if you were going to periodize the adaptive management program, what would be the key periods and moments of transition?
So I actually started in 1974, but the studies before that. That 1974 to 76 period was the first ecological inventory of the river. The dam was having effects. We were beginning to see them. Non-native species like burros, tamarisk, other things were having an impact on the river corridor, and this was the first opportunity to begin to describe those impacts. So that early study, I think, was a first step in this whole process. That was done by the Museum of Northern Arizona with Stephen Crothers was the lead on that. In the one step before that was, of course, in the early 60s, I get the right dates right here, 69, 70, 71, a really dramatic increase in the number of people coming to visit Grand Canyon through the river. So there's we went from just a few hundred people coming through the river corridor in the mid 60s to 20,000 in 1970. By 1970, 71, that was probably the first big step in this process, because suddenly there was public interest in the river. So then an ecological inventory was done, highly informative, set the stage for a lot of future studies, and identified fish species that were rare, historic photos that could be rematched and looked at the change through time, really dramatic stuff that way, and a lot of basic information on what was living in the river corridor. In the early 80s, the filling of Glen Canyon, of Lake Powell was kind of a big deal, because for the first time we had a full lake. Okay, so this is the future of water management in the Southwest. Our second largest reservoir is now full. Early 80s, not too much going on. I tested the spillway in 82, but the political element was rewinding the generators and inflaming this now large public that was exposed to the canyon, knew it and didn't want it degraded.
When was that?
The rewind decision was 1980 to 1982. In 1983, late 1982, 1982, the Secretary of the Interior threw some money at this program called the Glen Canyon Environmental Studies. That coincided with that winter, winter of 82, 83, was the largest snowpack that we've had in 100 years. That filled, the reservoir was full. They didn't have a way to manage for more than full. They didn't know what to do with all the water that came through. The biggest flood in post-dam time came through, just nearly took out the dam. $25 million of damage to the dam at Glen Canyon, the potential for loss of all the dams downstream if Glen Canyon Dam had failed. Really big deal.
That was an El Nino year, right?
It was an El Nino, but coupled with a big volcanic eruption. So that combination is what gives us our biggest snowpacks. That was probably the biggest snowpack since 1884, the Krakatoa eruption time. So that kicked off this GCS Phase 1 from 83 through 87, and lots of documentation and reports on that. Not so much peer-reviewed publication, but some. But mostly these are government publications. From 88 through 1991, really really through 95 maybe, for the Glen Canyon Environmental Studies Phase 2. That study was the Glen Canyon Environmental Studies Phase 1 pointed to the dam as having a big impact on the system. The Department of Interior came back and asked, okay, so if it's having an effect, what are the effects and can we modify them, modify dam operations? So Phase 2 was about pursuing those questions. That EIS culminated, so Grand Canyon Protection Act of 1992 set the stage for having this be a requirement, that operations of the dam not degrade the Grand Canyon River corridor. That was kind of a big step there. 1995, the EIS was finalized. 1996, the Record of Decision was signed. That set the stage for the Adaptive Management Program to begin. much learning, much policy process going on during all those phases, of course. Then adaptive management program gets established in 1997 and runs for 20 years, accumulating lots and lots of really high quality scientific information, especially on applied issues such as how to manage the river for sediment and how to manage endangered humpback chub. Those two questions have been the dominant questions. And so this recent EIS that was the kind of recapitulating, revisiting all that information and trying to set a new stage for management for the next 20 years was just signed a couple of months ago. Well, 2 months ago, yeah. So those are kind of the big steps in the political process, I would say.
December 2016 is when the,
It was either December or January. It might have been January, but I can't quite remember when the announcement was in. It was signed in Las Vegas.
and that's
It might have
the
been
LTEP.
December. Yeah, the LTEMP. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, interestingly, going on with all that, let's see, how's our time? Another minute? Sorry. Interestingly, going along with that whole political process were the ecological surprises. Every year, a new surprise. I mean, just right from every year that we've had this program going, some new surprise happened. Oftentimes, that's the arrival of some new species. Initially, we had bald eagles moved into the system. In 1983, the first bald eagle was seen in Grand Canyon. It actually living in the river, occupying the river corridor, feeding on fish, and being there. Bald eagles were endangered at that point, and therefore having a new endangered species move into the system was a really big idea. Big issue. That precipitated a whole wave of studies about bald eagle. Just before that, peregrine falcon population in Grand Canyon had erupted. They were also endangered at the time. Therefore, a whole suite of studies on peregrine falcons came about.
When was that?
When was that? Well, it was recognized, I think 1976, I did a trip. We found only 4 peregrine falcon nests in the whole canyon, 4 to 6. By 1985 or so, we had more than 100 pairs. That was in part related to a recovery program in the Rockies. The peregrines all came into Grand Canyon to feed. And it's just been one species after another. Now, these initial surprises were endangered species or important things like ducks. We had no duck breeding along the river until 1982. Mallard ducks began to breed in the river, and now every eddy, and there's got thousands of eddies in the river system. Pretty much every eddy in the upper canyon has a pair of mallard ducks breeding in it. So. That change happened. More recently, it's been endangered. It's been non-native species that have begun to arrive. New Zealand mud snail was a big deal initially, and is quite dominant in the upper sections. About 2009, the first quagga mussel was detected. Quagga mussel stand to change the entire structure of the ecosystem. So these are surprises that are. They could have been anticipated, I suppose, but we didn't really don't have that kind of far vision, future vision on them. So these things happen, and then the ecosystem tracks off in some other direction. Early on, the policy was because we understand the river is colder now because of the dam than it was in pre-dam time. The emphasis was on warming the river with a temperature control device put on the dam to draw surface water off and warm up the downstream river. Great, $200 million, now $500 million, very expensive undertaking. That whole discussion, though, recently has shifted to keeping the river colder to keep things like quagga mussel and some of the non-native fish at bay. So the whole mindset about temperature control, we have to change it and warm up. There's a huge amount of effort going into warming up the river. Now it's, we need to keep the river colder. So as these different surprises have happened. There have been different kind of impacts on basic thoughts about policy.
Has there been a change in how participants in the adaptive management program have thought about the effort to reshape the Colorado River ecosystems?
I would say behind the program are a whole suite of biases. Individual stakeholders or stakeholder groups have a particular focus on their resource of interest, and those have really not changed very much. It's been more how to manipulate the other side to get them to focus on the topics that keep those individual biases viable. And as an example, largely the present program with this LTEMP is focused on sand and humpback chub, two resources. Those are two of 10,000, 20,000 different possible resources we could look at in the river, but the program has kind of migrated to those 2 points and trying to solve those problems, and actually pretty much has now at least understands how to manage those 2 resources. But it doesn't pay attention to the many other issues that are in that system and that are important drivers. Okay.
Yes, it's perfect. We got about 3 minutes. At an administrative level, what was learned and accomplished during the time you were involved?
At an administrative level. Okay.
Not a good question. How would we rephrase that? Just what was learned and accomplished? Because I didn't want them to focus on one study that they did.
Right, yeah. I think the question might be more, what did you learn about the 3 legs of the stool? That might be more of a way to get folks to open up.
Great.
Everybody learns all the time about innuendos of policy. And the science is, of course, erupting all the time.
Okay, I'll rephrase that question. What do you think has been the value of the program? So now we're getting big. Overall, what do you think has been the value of the program? Next one, in your opinion, what have been the program's failings or limitations, and how might they be addressed in the future? And finally, give us 10 to 15 key words that are significant to the program and its evolution.
Okay.
And then the last one, who else do you recommend that we interview for their perspective? So we'll try to get through those.
Good.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
So we were talking about significant changes that occurred in the program over the time you've been involved. And you mentioned that there were changes in science and changes in management. How about changes in the social environment of the program over time?
Yeah, the program began as a internally directed closed program that was, if there was advice going to the Secretary of the Interior about how to manage the dam, that was not available to the public. Only by requesting comments on the rewind did the public even find out that the dam managers were going to increase the amount of flow fluctuation. But they did find that out, and that precipitated the initial wave of public concern that then led to the entire program. So engagement of the public is one element that was new to this whole process. Engagement of the tribes was also quite challenging for the managing agencies. The tribes are regarded as sovereign states, sovereign nations, and they don't talk to each other. And so it was only by the invitation of the Department of Interior, which oversees the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that you could actually begin to initiate conversations with the tribes, finding out which tribes regarded Grand Canyon as part of their homeland was an important step, and there are about 7 or 8 tribes that do that have it as a key feature of their culture. Several of the tribes have Grand Canyon as their place of emergence into this dimension, and that whole understanding gives them a very great focus on Grand Canyon, and therefore they've been engaged as stakeholders. There are half a dozen tribes now engaged in the program, but initially there was no mechanism to engage the tribes, or you had to have discussions about what the tribal values were that should be paid attention to in a management program.
When were they brought into the stakeholder process?
GCS Phase 1, which was led by David Wegner, he pretty much single-handedly turned the battleship of the Bureau of Reclamation 90 degrees to bring it into an open social process, active science, tribal engagement, and a dialogue about how to manage rather than a monolithic in-house kind of effort by the federal government.
What years was that?
He was a GCES program manager from late 82 until 1997. So I'd say engagement of the tribes has been one of the biggest steps forward for this program, and for the first time, not only the program but the public is actually beginning to learn about what tribal values are, and they're quite different than the management values that are held by any other stakeholder group of the 27 stakeholders that are on the adaptive management program. Other major shifts there. On the social side of it, the transition from the GCES program to the AMP was quite challenging. David Garrett became the Grand Canyon Monitoring Research Center chief, USGS, became a USGS office by about year 2000 or so. But for a while, that was the Department of Interior office that took over the GCS program. Once you start one of these programs, this GCS program engaged many people across the Southwest, all of whom began talking to each other for the first time, began asking questions, some of them doing research, some agencies following their interests in the program, meeting together, trying to figure out how to better understand what dam impacts were, and then how if possible, to mitigate those on Grand Canyon. That transition was quite difficult then, because it was an established program, had been running from 1983 to 1997, 15 years, and then was taken over by a much more formal and higher up federal process. Many people became disillusioned with that transition. Quite a bit of discomfort with transitioning this information system, information gathering structure that had been developed into the U.S. Geological Survey. Nonetheless, that's the way that program went, and the USGS as a bureaucracy took it over and rules the roost now.
Why was the transition in 1997 disillusioning to some people?
Because it was a pretty open, freewheeling program up to that point. If somebody had a question, finding the expertise to answer that question was there. It became constrained after '97 by the bureaucracies that were involved. First Department of Interior, and then by the U.S. Geological Survey. So now it's returned to a highly bureaucratized kind of information management system.
What did you learn over the many decades you've been involved? What have you learned about the program and its what I'll call its three stools: the science aspect of the program, the management decision-making aspect of the program, and the social aspect that you're also been talking about. What have you learned about the relationship between the three, their evolution, which ones have been more influential at what times, and change over time?
All right. If the three legs of this adaptive management stool are policy, science, and social process. When I started, of course, I was wrapping up my master's degree. I had no more idea how the government worked than any other American does. The Department of Interior houses together the National Park Service, which defends the integrity of natural landscapes, with the Bureau of Reclamation, which was at the time not only managing the dam but also managing marketing and making money off of the process, as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and other agencies within the department. These agencies have directly conflicting mandates, and yet they're all being managed as one. So understanding what those conflicts were, how the Department of Interior has to resolve them is quite a learning process there. And having policy discussions all the way up the food chain from our local Grand Canyon effort all the way to the Secretary of the Interior's office has been quite informative, seeing how decisions actually get made and conflicts get either resolved or swept under the carpet. The science side of it, much more comfortable with. It's been a pretty continuous process of putting out ideas, having those kicked around by various people, stolen by some agencies, and that's kind of the way some of this intellectual freedom is or intellectual property is not really respected much in these kind of discussions. So an idea that seems like a really great kind of cool thing to study often gets taken up by some agency who wants to pursue that and has the power to be able to take over the question. That's the way that works. But at least it's this proposition of ideas and thinking about things and asking questions, having those kicked around a bit, and seeing the way that those become programs of study. That makes pretty good sense in terms of the flow of science. There have been surprises in the science world that haven't been pursued enough necessarily, and some that we don't have the experimental capacity right now to achieve. For example, anybody who's ever seen a flooding river sees all the driftwood out in the middle of the river. It wasn't until we actually ran our first experimental flood in 1996 that we understood that the way that happens is that currents are being directed up against the shore that either bring sediment or tear sediment away from the shore, and then the current recirculates back out to the middle. So when you're looking at a flooding river and see a line of driftwood running down the middle of the river, it's because there's a countercurrent circulation pattern that develops at a certain threshold, and it's river specific, certainly. So that was quantified and actually measured in Grand Canyon for the first time. Hasn't been looked at really very much since. Many of those kind of surprises, scientific aha moments have come out of the program.
Can you think of any others that we want to mark for posterity or ask other members of the program about scientific surprises? Yes.
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. Some scientific surprises are science is really it's this debate about the nature of reality. But the other side of it is it's a personal exploration of our biases and our beliefs. And when something goes against your belief, and yet the data conclusively show you that you're wrong or just misguided, then it's the role of the scientist to actually accept that information and see what that means and explore it. One of the huge dilemmas in this system has been how the river should be managed for humpback chub. And based on information about the fish in the upper Colorado River Basin, chub appear to be a mainstream spawning fish up in the upper Colorado River Basin, where there are 5 populations that are of interest, all declining. In Grand Canyon, it is not a mainstream spawning fish. It spawns in the tributaries. And every place we find spawning going on is typically associated with some kind of tributary, or either a tributary coming in, like the Little Colorado River, or a spring coming up, and the fish congregate at these water sources. So, one of the persistent biases is how can we manage the river to best support humpback chub? Well, if their breeding is really going on in the tributaries, that's not as important a question as how can we make sure that their breeding is successful in the tributaries. Gradually, that's been more clearly recognized in Grand Canyon. Still not in the upper basin yet. We don't really know how they're breeding in the upper basin. It's hard to believe it's even the same fish. But coupled with that is the role of rainbow trout. Rainbow trout are in the Clearwater Reach in the upper portion of the river. Rainbow trout are usually insectivores or shrimp salad feeders, but they can occasionally feed on humpback chub and other larval fish. One of the big dialogues that's gone on scientifically has been, so if the trout are in the upper river and they're moving down into the lower river, are they posing a threat to humpback chub by eating their larvae? And the discussion on that has gone back and forth for 30 years. It wasn't until a resolution of a law, one of the few lawsuits that was ever kind of launched within this program, where the judge actually, his brief on the trial said there's no relationship between humpback chub and rainbow trout because the populations they're not changing in any kind of consistent way. The chub population was rising as the trout population was rising, so therefore it's not predation of trout on chub that is affecting that endangered fish. The trout are also non-native, so that throws that element in. The trout are also highly valued by the anglers up in the upper portion of the river above Lee's Ferry, where it's a big industry, and the failure of that industry affects a lot of people. Or the changing trout conditions up there are important to them.
Would it be accurate to say that one of the reasons that scientific question about the potential impact of rainbow trout on humpback chub, that the reason that went on for so long, was so controversial, is that you have one set of stakeholders interested in the chub and another set of stakeholders interested in the trout, and they weren't integrating their studies. They were seeking research that would validate their interests.
Yeah,
separately.
I would say certainly biases on the part of both groups are what dominated the way the research was conducted. In fact, with the chub, 4 different agencies were researching the chub, doing very different things with the chub, and only through this process in the later stages of GCS was that information beginning to be brought together. Now it's pretty well integrated. But still, the biases, the kind of embedded biases of the program are everywhere apparent there. Because the trout are non-native and because they're quite abundant, they must be bad and must have an impact on the chub. And all the data actually point in the opposite directions, that the chub don't really, they're not much influenced by rainbow trout. Brown trout is another non-native fish in the system. They do have a negative impact on chub, and nobody disagrees about that. But the role of rainbow trout has been much subject to, I say, agency bias, and that really shapes the way the research takes place too, which is it further embeds the condition rather than resolving it. So much of this work could be done experimentally, and one of my disappointments with the program is that we've never gotten an in-field experimental laboratory set up at Lee's Ferry, where we could actually test some of these very basic ideas without having to subject the entire river to a flow regime to see whether or not issue is something that can be managed with flows.
Okay, let me move to the next question. What key
Oops,
report?
can I add one more thing there? So
Please.
we talked about science, we talked about policy. I didn't talk much about the social leg of this. The insight that I've had about that was that every person involved in the program is trying to do their best. Every person there is working hard to support the themes and the constituents that they serve, and trying to do their best to have their interests well represented, strongly represented. And so that's been an insight. As a naive outsider, you might think good, bad, good, evil, whatever the interests might be, environmental interests against economic interest. There must be enemies here that are irreconcilable differences going on. That's not the case. Almost everybody that's been involved in the program that I've met is really working hard to ensure that the program works, that their interests are well represented, and that by doing so, in an adaptive management context, that those interests do get vetted fairly.
Which documents and reports are you aware of that have been produced over the years that you think are particularly important to keep on the forefront of our memory, that remain relevant or provide some historical precedent that was important?
Okay, so in the pre-Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program literature, Woodbury, 1959, is a ecological survey of Glen Canyon before it was dammed. Really important first look at the ecology of the river system. Stanton's book in 1890 also important in that he presented photographs of what the river looked like 100 years before this era of flow management took place. So 1976, the Carruthers et al. Report on the ecology of Grand Canyon, of the river corridor in Grand Canyon. Many papers came out of that, including Turner and Karpiskek's photo rematching and looking at the riparian vegetation changes pre versus post dam. In that era, papers beginning to identify, papers by Bob Dolan, for example, beginning to identify the effects of the dam on geomorphology of the river. And then I would say the final reports for the Glen Canyon Environmental Studies Phase 1 and Phase 2, both loaded with really great insights as to, from this shotgun science approach that was taken up, how these many different topics are beginning to play out. And by reading through those, one can begin to see patterns that have actually set the stage for pretty much all the science we're looking at now. That brings us up through about 1990. Grand Canyon Protection Act, very important, influential policy document that came out in 1992, requiring that dam operations not negatively influence the Grand Canyon. The EIS document in 1996, great compendium of all that information into one document for the purposes of setting up the adaptive management program. Stepping forward from then, it's been quite a many different research topics. There is a state of knowledge of Grand Canyon document produced in 2005. That was a pretty good summary of the of the more recent research up to that point. Each of the science topics that's studied by the U.S. Geological Survey undergoes a PEP, stands for protocol evaluation panel review. So those are important documents for each of the themes of science being taken up. Those are done about every 5 years or so. A paper by Mellis and Mellis and Lovich on the results of adaptive management, effects of adaptive management of Grand Canyon. The success of the program was a 10-year analysis of how successful the adaptive management program was in terms of the key resources that are being monitored. That's an important one. And then the LTEMP document tries to summarize that information as well. This again is the best studied river in the world, so it's got literally thousands of peer-reviewed documents, tens of thousands of agency policy reports and white papers. Vast. So that makes it really difficult for anybody to really. It would take several years actually to go through all that literature, I think, and really be able to use it in decision making.
Well, perhaps you can cut through all the static of those hundreds and thousands of research reports and tell us, big picture, what you think the value of the program has been and is today. Should we continue the program and why?
Good question. This whole theme of adaptive management is something that Carl Walters and others began to put forth in the 70s. Their conceptualization of adaptive management was based on the understanding that ecosystems are too complicated for humans to be able to manage them, and that really we should use science in an experimental context to be able to improve our decision making. If experiments didn't work, then reverse our policy, our management strategy, and follow a lead that makes more sense in terms of what the science tells us. So that form of adaptive management is not what we have. We have an adaptive management strategy that is based on stakeholder concerns and how to balance stakeholder concerns rather than how the ecosystem itself is functioning. As an ecosystem ecologist, I always go back to the original kind of hope that we'll be managing the ecosystem for its natural functioning and trying to understand how many of the goods and services we can extract from it without harming it, and the timing of that kind of extraction. But that's not the way the program is structured. It's about social engagement of many stakeholders, all of whom have some vested interest in some portion of the resources, and hoping that all that dialogue combined will somehow work towards an effective management system that supports the ecosystem, but also supports the subsidies that are being extracted from it. This is probably the most successful adaptive management program in the world. So therefore, that alone is relevant. The social program gets us some way down the road towards effective ecosystem management, leaves many things off to the side, but we have been able to engage members of the population that have and cultures that have not previously had a voice. So the half a dozen tribes that are involved in this program have a voice and have had great influence on the way the program's developed. For example, the Uto-Aztecan tribes in the process feel it's wrong for there to be a lot of loss of life in the system. Fish, especially aquatic life, which is really important to Zuni and Hopi tribes, and that therefore programs that seek to control, say, rainbow trout in the portion of the canyon where they're not commercially fished, should simply not kill a trout. The trout should be if they're being managed, they shouldn't be killed because death there is not appropriate. These are the birthplaces of their culture. So they don't want to see fish massacres going on in their homeland, at the very heart of their homelands. So that's actually had a huge impact on the way the fisheries program has been structured. And so having that indigenous information come into the program has been really important, and something we certainly respected very deeply. From the standpoint of the program working, it works. It stumbles along pretty well. This is such a process of sitting in the chair. You know, the only way it works is you have to sit in the chair for 2 days every 2 or 3 months and listen carefully to what's being said, and try to pose questions that are going to actually change the way the rest of the group sees the process going. And it takes kind of a lot of diligence to do that. And my hat's off to everybody who's been with the program and actually going through that process, because it just takes a lot of patience and attention to the quality of the program. So the success of the program relies on that. I think the other advantages of the program are certainly that it's brought to light so much information about the management of a constrained river, geologically constrained river. These are places that are, these are the places that dams are usually placed. So we've actually lost enormous volumes of the earth to impoundment without ever understanding how they work ecologically. So there's been a great advantage to scientific understanding of these kind of habitats. Large deep canyons are at risk everywhere in the world because of dams. So those are scientifically, policy-wise, and socially, I think they're strong advantages to having the program go on. And with the LTEMP decision, that puts in place this structure for the next 20 years anyway. But I'll say one more thing there, though, that the success of the program relies on the Secretary of the Interior being an active part of the program. The Secretary of the Interior usually designates somebody from his office to come in, one of his undersecretaries, to come in and oversee, to be the recipient of the advice from the program. When the Secretary is weak or uninterested, that breaks down and the program suffers. So because this is a federal advisory committee, it requires strong active engagement with the Department of Interior.
Can you think of examples in the past when that process has broken down because of less effective participation from the Department of Interior?
Many examples, yeah. As the administrations come and go, the interest on the part of the Secretary of the Interior reflects the interest in the President in these complicated environmental and economic interactions. And so when that designee or the Secretary of the Interior themselves are disinterested, we end up with we just let the stakeholders choose what they want to look at, and that situation prevailed for the first 8 years of the program, 8 or 10 years of the program, in which the stakeholders said, "Well, I want to study chub because I'm a Fish and Wildlife Service representative, and chub are an endangered species. I want to study trout because I'm an angler. I represent the anglers. I want trout to be there." If there weren't strong voices for a resource, then they simply didn't get on the Christmas tree. These are kind of research ornaments on a tree, but we never get to understand what the tree was like. So we're putting these pieces together, or maybe we're building a house, but not from the foundation up. We're starting on the 3rd floor and trying to understand what the house is going to look like by the time we get to the ground. So with weak oversight, we end up with a complicated kind of stakeholder-led selection of research topics.
So a personal question about all of this. You've articulated reasons why the program is valuable and its accomplishments. Why have you remained involved in the program for so long? What have you gotten out of it?
All right. Again, my deep appreciation and attachment to Grand Canyon is what drives my interest in the program. I learn with every person I talk to in this program, and every passenger I take down the river, and even from the simplest questions, I learn what I learn more about my relationship to Grand Canyon. So it's just a continually enlightening exercise to pursue this. I have not only. Let's see. Our organization is pretty small. We often don't have funding, so I do a lot of my work pro bono. But the effort at trying to do our best to manage Grand Canyon is what drives me. And so, whatever it takes to do that, I'll be in the chair.
Looking back,
Maybe except unless there's a river trip that might conflict with the time that I should be in the chair.
river trip takes priority. Yes.
Not necessarily, but I try to keep them. I try to manage my time carefully.
What do you think have been the program's failings or limitations, and how would you like to see those resolved or addressed?
All right. We have the tools to be able to answer questions without having to subject the river to treatments. And one of the failures of the program has to do with our with the unwillingness of some stakeholders to use the models we have to answer questions, at least conceptually answer those questions before we encounter those situations. One example is that the Lake Powell is used to sometimes, under good flow years, used to equalize the level of Lake Mead. And under those years, a lot of water was released out of Lake Powell and sent downstream to Lake Mead. A very straightforward question is, and we have very good models of how flow and sediment interact, and given different starting conditions for sediment in the river. Sediment is derived from tributaries. As it builds up, then we have the ability to manage it. So we could use these models to answer the question, how can we best manage the flow, the equalization flows for the reservoir, for these two reservoirs, to minimize sediment export. So we preserve the sediment supplies that we have in the system using these models. What's the right way to do it? We don't have to. We don't threaten anybody's water allocation or any issue with hydropower production necessarily. We're just running a model to see what the right way to do it is. The system is resistant to that. The water and power interests they don't want to go there because then that might shift their ability to market hydropower for some reason. So that to me is a limitation, is that we've made some pretty good headway with understanding, really great headway with the modeling, and these are questions that we could answer with the tools we've got, but because it threatens the behaviors of these different organizations that market power, they don't want to test those models in that fashion.
Can you think of possible pathways for resolving that shortcoming in the program?
Again, it would take strong leadership by the Department of Interior to help with that, because water and power is, they're pretty resistant to any kind of potential threat to their the way they manage their organizations. And they've taken quite a hit with modification of the dam over time, modification of the flow regime from the dam over time. Dampened flow fluctuations were the result of the 1996 EIS, and those have been perpetuated now into the present, so that they can no longer run these huge daily tides through the system. More conversation with them, continued to push on it, but it would take strong secretarial support to use the models that we have to test some of those notions. One thing I've been particularly one idea that I've had that's been particularly strongly rejected was using the models to look at flow fluctuation on every other day. again, higher flows produce more hydroelectric power, run one day with running alternate days of hydropower production, or a different, maybe multi-days. And there's many issues there, because if you run daily flow fluctuations from the dam, those translate into a wave form that is a very fast uprising wave, scours up a lot of sediment. And if you could slow down that cycle, then you could probably slow down a lot of the erosion rates. Using the models, again, this is not having to subject the system to this kind of analysis. Use the models we have, which are perfectly capable of doing this, to test out these alternative flow regimes that might be much more conservative of sediment. And then look at the models are also set up to look at the economic costs of those. So those are great tools to be able to have, and if we can ask those kind of questions, we might be able to get at what the right flow regime is to best support both the economics and the ecosystem.
You've talked about different phases that the program has evolved through over time, and you've talked about the importance of a strongly committed Secretary of Interior to the effective functioning of the Adaptive Management Program. Can you reflect back on which administrations, in your experience, have been most effective in advancing the Adaptive Management Program, and which administrations have not been as effective in advancing the goals and accomplishments of the program?
Yes, quite easily. And I don't understand really the relationships between the Secretary of the Interior and the President in any of these situations, but to say that under Bruce Babbitt's time as Secretary of the Interior, and under Ken Salazar's time as Secretary of the Interior, those are the big advances in terms of strong secretarial support, really great secretary designees, and Castle, I hope, is somebody that you'll be able to interview. Fabulous at the high level policy implications, and keeping a bunch of renegade stakeholders on track and helping move the program forward.
Great. I just thought of a rather controversial, speculative question. There's a lot of talk these days about what to do with the reservoirs behind Lake Mead and Lake Powell, because both are half empty or more than half empty.
Yeah.
Climate change is not giving us much confidence that those reservoirs will be full again in our lifetimes. A former commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation has actually advocated for the dismantling, or at least if not the dismantling of Glen Canyon Dam, the emptying of the reservoir. What do you think of that possibility, and how would that affect river flow regimes in the Grand Canyon and the whole legacy of the program?
Yeah, I deal with this question every day. Every day. Glen Canyon Dam was built where it was built because it lies just upstream of the boundary between the Upper Colorado River Basin and the Lower Colorado River Basin. That boundary is at a place called Lee Ferry, just downstream from Lee's Ferry, and it is probably the most politically important point in the Southwest, because the river has been divided into these two basins. And the 1922 Colorado River Compact requires that on average 8.23 million acre feet of water pass past Lee Ferry each year from the upper basin into the lower basin. That's on average, on a 10-year average. And it's overallocated. Only about 7.5 million acre feet can be delivered reliably in a 10-year period. That's the political context of where the dam is. Lake Powell, 180 miles long, will take 640 years to completely fill with sediment. We're 54 years into the story right now, so we've got a long time before that actually becomes compromised by sedimentation. Lake Mead, because of the Glen Canyon Dam, is protected from, it's got a lifespan of 1,000 years or more. Yes, the reservoirs are low now. Climate change is not looking very promising in terms of being able to fill Lake Mead, but The upper basin is actually not in anywhere near as bad shape in terms of the climate change projections as the lower basin is. Therefore, filling of Lake Powell is certainly not impossible. Will probably happen again. And we're probably at the end of concluding a kind of a long-term drought here, and so in the next 5 to 10 years, we may see a change in the way that a change in snowpack and melt off, and how the lake fills, the reservoir fills. So draining Lake Powell to support Lake Mead is something that's been proposed by some people. It was entertained in the EIS actually. Fill Mead first means let Lake Powell just simply go dry. There's an ecological problem here. Glen Canyon Dam is blocking the inflow of non-native fish and non-native fish diseases that would almost certainly wipe out the remaining native fish in Grand Canyon. Many non-native fish in the upper basin, a host of fish diseases that are being now blocked by the dam. So simply letting the river flow through Glen Canyon and into Grand Canyon, while that sounds like a great thing to do as a conservationist, oh good, bring back the river, that's fabulous, good thought there, except for we would probably lose the resources that we were trying so hard to preserve in Grand Canyon because of that process, the biological resources. The upper basin, the river is paved in catfish, as far as I can tell. You can't throw a line out anywhere there and not catch a catfish within 1 minute. And the native fish in the upper basin are dreadfully threatened. So we've got some real
catfish is a non-native.
Catfish is non-native, carp are non-native, 20 other non-native species in that system, and many of them are predators, warm water predators, and much better approach from my standpoint, even though I'm supposed to be a conservation advocate, is to really study carefully the ecology of Cataract Canyon, because Cataract Canyon, this is upstream from Lake Powell, is a place where we get all the normal functioning of a wild river. Huge variation in flow over the course of the year, lots and lots of sediment. The temperatures warm up, very warm in the summer and ice covered in the winter, all the conditions that took place in Grand Canyon. And if those are the conditions that we want to recover in Grand Canyon, restore in Grand Canyon, what are the consequences of those conditions on the native fauna and fish and terrestrial fauna? The story is not actually very good. The natural river up there has very few native fish, very little shoreline kind of viability, and lots of challenges up there that if we were to restore those conditions in Grand Canyon would be a disaster for our natural resources and especially the biota in Grand Canyon. These are big challenges because again the bias is, well, we should restore Grand Canyon. If we're good environmentalists, we should restore the natural physical conditions, and therefore everything will be in good shape. But that's not the case. So therefore, we're stuck with the situation of keeping the dam as an important barrier to non-native species influx, learning enough about the Grand Canyon portion of the river to be able to preserve those features that we want to have there, the species that we want to have there, prevent non-natives from taking over and decimating the river ecosystem, and having that be still something socially acceptable in terms of hydropower production and the subsidy delivery that we expect from Glen Canyon Dam. It's a huge challenge, and without going through that whole discussion with people, eliminating the dam sounds like a great idea to the public, but there are many issues that actually have to be considered before that takes place, and we have the time. So in terms of environmental policy, it's a bit of a challenge to get these points across.
Some of what you've been saying highlights a couple of concepts that are critical to conservation history, preservation, and restoration. And it sounds like part of the goal of the adaptive management program is to preserve some of the natural functioning of the river, which is challenged, perhaps inhibited to a certain extent by operations of the dam, and to restore some of the lost characteristics, ecological characteristics of the river. But in your discussion with us, you're suggesting that in some instances we can't go back. And in some instances, in order to preserve some of the things that we want, we can't let nature take its course because there are serious challenges to it. We've got to invest time and money and labor to preserve certain ecosystems. Can you reflect a little bit about how we should understand these twin goals of preservation and restoration, understand those in a way that makes sense in a real river rather than just being ideals that aren't applied in a real place? Yeah,
so a paper that Jack Schmidt and I and several other co-authors wrote in Bioscience in 1998 lays out the terrain of what might be achievable in terms of management and the role of science in that. These are complicated questions. They require very clear valuation of resources. So if we want to keep humpback chub as a species on Earth, we need to manage the Grand Canyon in a way that supports it. What's the right way to do that? That's been 30 years of research, and we're still learning. It's been $500 million spent on about 10,000 fish so far. A huge amount of money has been spent trying to understand how to keep humpback chub in the picture. Because we have enough humpback chub to work with, that money, certainly went somewhere. For other species, we've lost in that system, southwestern yellow flycatcher, lost quite a few species that aren't listed. 85 taxa by my count with one of the committees I serve on. Groups of species that have been lost because of dam presence and operations. Trying to understand what our values are for species, for resources, for experiences for the public, as well as the valuation of hydropower production and water delivery downstream. Balancing those out into a coherent framework is the challenge of the program, and that, I think now, with respect to Native American concerns about the landscape as well, because theirs are spiritual concerns as well as resource concerns. Putting that all together and sorting that all out, fast change is what humans are really good at. Make a policy decision and we'll take out the dam, okay, or build a dam. And those have enormous impacts on the fabric of nature as well as the social context of these changes. Humans are good at changing things too quickly, not good at stepping back and saying, well, let's study this for a couple decades actually to really get at the answers, so we know what the consequences of our decisions are. One example within this context was the discussion about the temperature control device, TCD. Okay, we're going to build it. And we actually came pretty close to just building it. You can't necessarily go back. That's the issue. And just as we can't recover our own youth, we can't go back to how we were when we were teenagers or whatever, you can't simply take away something that's been constructed in an ecosystem and have the ecosystem return to its natural condition. There are always consequences. You warm up the water for a few years and crayfish may colonize. You can't get rid of crayfish. There's just no way to eliminate them. They eat everything and you can't control them. So therefore, if you warmed up the water with a temperature control device and allowed crayfish to get started, you'd have an irreparable change to the system that would completely take the trajectory of development of the ecosystem in a different direction. So that's an important thing to understand. Is we can't go back. We have to make decisions based on what we have, what we know we can, what we can learn about, what we can model is particularly useful, then we don't have to manipulate the system to move further. But you know, it's just the hard work of accepting that we've got an altered ecosystem, and that fast changes, quick policy decisions, we're probably not going to solve our problems.
So if we can't always preserve or restore a particular species, an endangered species, and we can't always preserve or restore a particular assemblage of plants along the river, say on a beach, what is it that the adaptive management program is restoring and preserving?
Yes, yeah. So there's very little guidance in this, as to what as to what we can achieve, what we should achieve, and it's right now that's driven by policies of different agencies. Park Service wants its purpose is to preserve the natural condition. Has no capacity to really manage for an altered condition, because it's altered. The Park Service should always be driving itself towards the natural condition, and they use that sometimes as an excuse for not acting, because letting nature take its course is the way that the Park Service thinks it's getting its job done. One example there is the riparian vegetation has grown up dramatically as a surprise in the system. Profuse development of riparian vegetation along the river. 300 miles of riparian vegetation, the biggest stand of riparian vegetation left in the Southwest, and where 90% of this habitat has been eliminated. Incredibly productive for birds, for wildlife, for insect life. It's not natural. Therefore, there's always been a reluctance on the part of the National Park Service to want to manage that system. It'd be better to have it not be there. But the park is now an island of habitat for birds and wildlife that require that kind of habitat and have lost it elsewhere. So the Park Service, if they lost that habitat, would actually be doing grave and perhaps irreparable harm to the wildlife and bird species of the Southwest. How you know, are we willing to actually accept our role in this human-dominated ecosystem as managers? And many of the existing policies are kind of in conflict with us being able to step up to the plate on that.
What do you think should be the goal for the adaptive management program? For example, should we, instead of trying to recover or preserve specific ecosystems or species, should we try to recover or preserve resiliency or biological productivity? Is there other kinds of concepts like that could guide us in this difficult situation where we don't know what's natural and whether we can go back or not to a previous time?
Yeah, in this paper by Jack Schmidt and et al. In 1998, we lay out the train that the altered river system is it's not natural. It's got components that are desired, and it's got artifacts of the past that are still valued. And the balance of managing those together, along with the goods and services being produced by hydropower production and water delivery, that is the balance that we're working with. It's a social process to value those, to decide which we want to maintain. Somehow in this adaptive management process, that's proceeding, although the valuation process for things other than humpback chub and sediment resources is not very clear. But the process is going in that direction without a lot of large course scale kind of overview of what those directions are.
That makes sense.
We're getting there whether we want to or not, and we don't really understand where we're getting to. Yeah. But at least we've got some framework there to be able to understand as changes are happening what some of those changes are.
Are you hopeful?
Always. Because I get to study natural history and evolution, that gives me long-term hope. yes, things will be quite different in the future, and loss of some of these species is something I try to work against. So for me, any human-caused extinction is a crime, and therefore that's one way I proceed in life, is try to make sure that nothing goes extinct that I have some kind of power to prevent.
That was a nice place to end. I am going to ask you a couple of practical nuts and bolts kind of questions to finish this up.
Good.
One is if you could give us some keywords that you think are
Oh, yeah.
significant to the program and its evolution. We're going to make a keyword list and make sure that everything in the archive is tagged with these important keywords.
Okay. Well, certainly it's going to be the humpback chub, sandbars, flow, traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, adaptive management, flow regulation, the way we have described the ecosystem is the Colorado River Ecosystem, CRE. So that's a common acronym for that. But it's the function that captures the concept imperfectly, captures the concept of that a river is more than water. It's also where the water has been. The terraces, the landforms, as well as the species make up the river. I guess the various policies that are in play that matter: the Organic Act of the National Park Service, the Endangered Species Act, the Grand Canyon Protection Act, the LTEMP rod. How many is that? That's a dozen.
15.
Okay,
That's
good.
good.
So it's a starting point, but you'll have many more.
Yeah, I made some notes to tag acronyms, as you mentioned, and to tag the documents and reports, but also to tag tribes and stakeholders and federal agencies.
Yeah.
So I'll have Jennifer start a document in the Dropbox folder for tagging. And here's my notes actually from the interview. And then you can go back and listen to that last section of the interview and pull those off too. And if you have any questions about what they are, you can write to me as well as Larry. He's in the field a lot, so if you don't hear back from him, that means he's out there.
I'm electronically available. Electronically available most, let's see, until April 3rd, April 2nd.
Is there anything else that you'd like us to ask you while we've got you on tape today?
You've I think, hit on most of the topics. Hope is important in this program, I think. And it'd be very interesting to know how hopeful some of your next interviewees are on this.
Yeah, that was a spontaneous question that
yeah.
came up from the conversation, and I thought, I like that, and I think I should ask everybody that.
Yeah.
It'll be revealing. There is another question. Who else do you recommend we interview?
Oh, right.
You and I have already done.
Yeah, we've talked about that. Dave Wegner for the pre AMP part of the program. Dave Wegner is critical. He lives in Tucson. I think I sent you his information?
I don't know if I have his contact information yet, but you did say that he lives in Tucson.
Yeah.
So I'll have to double check. I have some notes.
For the tribal representation in this program is usually by white guys who represent the tribe, right, because the tribe
hired consultants.
Yes, but very, very long-term people. So they also maybe not be on there, maybe haven't been on the list. But Mike Yates,
Where's he?
Y-E-A-T-T-S. He's Hopi. He's with the Hopi. Kurt Dungowski with the Zuni tribe.
How do you spell his last name?
Dongowski, Dongowski, and
Don, you said?
Kurt.
Kurt.
Yeah, Kurt, and then Kerry Christensen with the Wallapai tribe. Kery Christensen with an E.
Dongowski is with
Zuni.
Zuni.
Yeah. So their perspectives would be, I think, quite interesting to hear as well.
And you said Kerry is Wallapai?
Wallapai, yeah.
Yeah, I'll add them to the list and we'll start looking for contact information.
Yeah, the other tribes have people that show up occasionally, are not quite as well informed in long term as these three guys are.